Okay, so we've talked about evidence for evolution and natural selection. Now we're going to move on to talk about how we name things. Now, Mother Nature doesn't really care, but we as humans like to put things in little categories so that we can figure out what these are, and it makes it easier for us to remember things. So let's talk about classification of species. So what we usually use in biology is something called binomial nomenclature. Now, this uses a genus name and a species name. Notice that the genus and species are italicized. If they're together, they're italicized. And notice that the genus is capitalized, but the species is not. Genus capitalized, species is not. This naming convention was popularized by Linnaeus, but he was not the one who developed it. But he liked it because it was consistent, and in the Congress of Zoology in 1889, during one of the world's fairs, that was the first meeting, they got together and decided to use this particular way of naming species. It gives each organism a unique name, and by using a universal system, accepting the system, it makes an understanding of the name no matter what language you speak. As long as you can see it written out in Latin, you will know what you're talking about, whether you speak Chinese, Japanese, English, Romanian, or whatnot. That Congress of Zoology meets every 4 years, and part of what they do is to examine and update the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature, which are the rules that they set forth that everyone should follow in order to keep a universal and consistent naming pattern for all the species that are discovered. Here is an example of how the binomial nomenclature would be used. You have the common pebble crab, that's the common name, and then the scientific name would be Xanthias lamarckii. Again, note, it is in italics. You have the genus first, species second, and genus is capitalized, species is not. Binomial nomenclature uses the most exclusive level of our description of life. The most inclusive, that at the very top level, we have the domains, Eubacteria, Archaea, and Eukarya. Now, Eubacteria are the true bacteria, and they are prokaryotes. Then you have the Archaea, which are also prokaryotes, but due to certain genetic sequencing, genetic codes, and structures, they are considered a separate group. And then off of that, you have the eukaryotes, which are the organisms that you are most probably familiar with, besides bacteria, the ones with membrane-bound organelles. In other words, you. Now, when we look at the relationship, the bacteria came first, then off of it branched off the archaea, and archaea appears to be most closely related to eukarya, or more closely related to eukarya than it is to bacteria. Again, due to those structures that separated them from bacteria. Under domain, you have 7 more taxonomic labels. You have the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. The way I usually remember it is through the mnemonic. King Philip can often find good soldiers. However, if you can develop your own and find one that works for you, go ahead and use it. But if you don't have one, this one works for me. Your mileage may vary. An example of how it might be applied, you have domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Carnivora, family forgive me, I can't pronounce this right, probably, Canidae, Canidae, genus Vulpes, and species Vulpes vulpes, which is your red fox. Another example would be Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, primate, Hominidae, Homo sapiens, what you probably belong to. Then, another example from the plants would be Plantae, Angiospermophyta, Dicotyledonnae, Rosales, Papilionaceae. I teach this every year, and I always have difficulty with some of the names. Sium and Sativum. Alright, so this is the general taxonomic nomenclature we use, but this is not the only classification system. Another one, not the only other one, but another one would be the phylogenetic classification system, where you're looking at different species and looking at what their common ancestors are. This classification is, of course, a human construct. Nature doesn't care, as I said before, but being a human construct, it's prone to errors. For example, sometimes we find out more information as we study things that the most common ancestor of one group is actually different from what we originally imagined. An example here would be the Aster group, which is native to Europe and Asia, and they thought they found a similar species in North America, namely Aster cordifoliolus, and then with further research they figured out it actually evolved separately from their actual Aster genus. So they had to rename it, of course following the conventions, so that we could understand, researchers would know just by looking at those names that they have different evolutionary ancestors, and they had renamed it to Symphyotrichum cordifolium, similar to Cordifolius, but they did change it so to help avoid confusion since the name was already taken previously. Alright, in order to figure out what the actual names are, in the bad old days, which is pretty much before the age of the internet, all you had to rely on were old books, old textbooks. You had to go through libraries, you had to read all the papers, see if anyone's found it before, and if there are multiple publications of, hey, I discovered this, you have to look at which one published first, and then that's the name that is used. However, now in the age of the internet, wonderful, wonderful invention that was, we have the Integrated Taxonomic Information System, ITIS, where we can actually deposit all the names, find out what year it was described, and therefore anyone who thinks they discovered a new species can go back to ITIS and take a look, oh, is it actually already there? And if you're trying to figure out the different names, you could look at what the different names are and what year it was published. However, again, we are human, so there are constantly arguments about what constitutes a species. A good example would be the corals in the Pacific. There are people who will describe a large set of similar corals as one species, and others who would describe within that set specific individuals, specific morphotypes, and call them separate species. So there are the groupers, the lumpers. That's all human convention again. Nature doesn't care. They just live. Again, the classification that we often use in science is the natural classification system that is based on ancestry. It has lots of uses. I'm not going to run through them all. You can see some examples on the screen. The way it works is by separating groups by common ancestors. Who do they share before they diverged off? And as you keep on going further and further back, it becomes more and more inclusive with that common ancestor. If we go far back enough in time, you notice that there's one single point there. And that single point represents an organism or a population of organisms, species, that every living organism on this planet currently shares an ancestry to. So, if you're asking, am I related to a dog, a cat, a bacteria, the answer would be, we think so, yes. If you go far back enough in time, because then all life on this planet would have the last universal common ancestor, LUCA, or a last universal ancestor, which is estimated to be around 3.5 to 4 billion years ago.